Too dark. All right. Okay. Oh, right. Help me. Alright, where is my hairbrush? Okay, alright, here we go. Okay, good morning everybody. Happy Friday, yeah, so it is Friday, so that's good. I'm happy it's Friday. Not that I don't love being here, just feeling a little tired today. Okay, so last time, right, we were talking about our kind of different generational cohorts, what they look like in their youth, and kind of what that suggests, how these trends have carried forward, how it's affected them into adulthood, and all of this fun kind of stuff. So we finished off talking about Gen X last time, right? So this is this generation born from the mid-1960s to the end of the 1970s, beginning of the 1980s. So we're going to move on now to, wrong slide, the millennials, right? And so millennials, I think, are really interesting. We're going to talk a lot about the millennials throughout the course, just because the millennials, we have a ton of data on them, right? As we went forward in time, more and more kind of research tools were applied to different generational cohorts. So we have a ton of information about the millennials, kind of at every stage of their life. So yeah, this generation born, 1980, and then some of these numbers are a little different depending on who you ask. Again, some people put it at 1982, but no later than that for the start of the millennials. And ending at about 1994, which means the youngest millennials are now, outside of emerging adulthood. Like they've just finally, well, I guess this year, they'll be turning 30, right? So they'll be out of our kind of window of youth, right? Into their 30s and out of what we might call emerging adulthood. Okay, so the millennials, obviously a really recent generation. Their impact is still being felt in lots of ways, right? And yeah, in ages, you're roughly talking somewhere between 44 and 30, right? In terms of how old they are today. So, all right, what do the millennials look like? So this data, again, mostly from Gene Twenge. I'm gonna mix and match with the millennials a little bit, taking some information from Twenge, and then when we talk about their cultural world and kind of their outlook on the world, I'm going to take a bunch of information from another source, which is the National Study of Youth and Religion, which spent a lot of time looking at the millennials as they were rounding into the teen and emerging adult years. So I'll try to flag where each of those different kind of sources of data are. Okay, so this is from Gene Twenge, and specifically this is from her book, Generation Me, about the millennials. So you can tell what she thinks of millennials. All right, so, just kind of major kind of salient points about the millennials, right? A firm belief in self-expression and the idea the only person you need to express is yourself, right? Or is yourself. Very much like this is the culmination of those trends that we start to see in the boomers that become more pronounced in Gen X, which then, really become even more pronounced in Gen Z of you're an important person, or sorry, not Gen Z, millennials. You're a really important person. right? And you know, you're special in some way, so special that the only person, you know, you need to impress is yourself, right? You don't need to, you don't need to impress anybody else. This kind of self-love, you know, focus on self-gratification, self-esteem, right? Again, we kind of saw this beginning with that transition in the boomers, from that rebelliousness in the boomers to kind of self-help. Not surprisingly, finds its, you know, really its apogee in the millennials. And it's not surprising, right? So who are the parents, especially of a lot of the older millennials? You're talking about baby boomers, right? So these are people very much focused on self-improvement, self-help, and they bring all of that to their parenting, which then ultimately sort of affects the millennials as well. Yeah, and so what Twenge will suggest, it gives rise to a generation of narcissists, right? So this is, you know, narcissistic personality inventory scores for US college students. And you know, here you've got in the shades, you got where the millennials are taking the survey, right? And what you see is that those markers for narcissism shoot up, you know, pretty substantially when we're talking about when the millennials are in the kind of survey. So, you know, we definitely see, you know, they're special, they believe they're special, entitled, and superior. And like I said last time, Twenge suggests this is much truer of older millennials, right? Those born more towards 1980 than it is towards the tail end of the millennials, right? Those who are much more similar to Gen Z, right? Who are closer in age to the older part of the Gen Z cohort. But certainly for the older millennials, right? We are talking about, you know, focus on self-gratification and, you know, a lot of senses of being superior. Yeah, the empowered self, they believe that dreams can become reality and they can have it all, right? And this is a marker of the millennials, which will cause a little bit of friction once they enter into college and the workforce, right? Because suddenly things get really, really hard. And yeah, the rise of anxiety, you know, we'll see this much more pronounced when we get to Gen Z. But this, you know, after dipping a little bit, in some cases for Gen X, especially as they become adults, stress, anxiety, and depression rise for millennial, so does suicide. So yeah, I mean, what Twenge will say, and we'll talk about this a lot as we get towards the end of the course again, this idea that, you know, self-focus leads to a lot of freedom, but a lot of loneliness as well. And this will get exacerbated eventually by technology also. And yeah, pressure to stand alone and kind of prove yourself as an individual. It's a big marker of kind of millennial culture. Yeah, apathy, the rise in apathy, declining belief in the efficacy of hard work. And this is a weird one, and Twenge will kind of make this point in generations, that millennials seem to believe that they are incredibly hard done by as a generation, that they're never going to get ahead, right? That somehow they're always going to be behind the 8 ball, especially economically. So what's the point in kind of working hard, you know, especially in the workplace? Now this turns out not to be true. Millennials are doing fine. If you look at almost, you know, in the US, especially Canada, a little bit less so. But if you look at any of the markers, you know, millennial-led households are doing as well, if not better, than boomers and Gen Xers were at the same time in terms of kind of things like home ownership, salaries, a little bit less in terms of wealth, right? So how much, you know, wealth they actually have, home equity, savings, and all of those things, but it's minor. But, you know, there's this real belief that took hold, especially around 2008 and the big financial crisis, 2008, 2009, that the millennials had been screwed and that they were never going to catch up. But, you know, there's not really a ton of statistics that actually bear this out. Yeah, and I mean, some of this bleeds into millennials are a much less politically engaged generation as well. You know, they've kind of, you know, there's a cynicism, you know, around politics or the power of collective action, and millennials have been fairly disengaged, and that remains true. Gen Z reverses this a little bit. They get a little bit more politically engaged, but millennials, to a large extent, are much less politically engaged. Yeah, I mean, kind of following that same trend of Gen X, millennials became sexually active far earlier than boomers, right? There's this much greater gap, especially as age of first marriage continues to rise. For millennials, there's this really big gap between the first time they become sexually active and when they ultimately get married, and that, you know, that trend just continues. You know, and honestly, for most millennials, especially the older part of the cohort, sex in their teen years was pretty normal and trending towards around 15 as the average age. One of the weird things, we'll talk about this too when we talk about like hookup culture later in the course. This is the generation that really starts to separate sexual kind of behavior from emotional involvement, where you get the idea of the hookup really becoming prominent. And so, you know, sex and kind of emotional involvement in a lot of ways become really, really disconnected. It's not that obviously there weren't, you know, what people would have called one-night stands prior to the millennials, but it becomes really common. And like when we'll see that later in the course, it becomes sort of the normalized sexual script for millennials to detach emotion from sex. And yeah, I mean, the internet, obviously internet porn becomes available to millennials fairly early in their life in quantities and varieties, you know, never before imagined by humans. And yeah, diversity, up to that point, and Gen Z will be more diverse than millennials, but up to that point, they were the most diverse generation, you know, ever on record. Still, like, if we're talking about the US, majority white, and Canada as well. Still majority white for millennials, but that majority is shrinking. They're in contact with more people of different cultures, and, you know, so we see, you know, a decline in what we think of as prejudices, especially around, you know, religion, race, sexual orientation. Much more tolerant than other generations, especially once you get into the middle to late part of the millennials. Early millennials, a little bit less so. But it's seen as no big deal and just what should be the norm, right? In fact, being, you know, discriminatory against people becomes a big deal because it's so out of the norm for what millennials expect at the end of the day. Okay. So, in most ways, millennials grew up with the internet as part of their lives, right? Now, the older part of the millennials are going to remember, like, that would be me, right? I was born in 1982, so I'm sort of towards the early part of the millennial generation. Early millennials will remember the sort of end of the analog era of Gen X, right? Still would have grown up with, you know, cassette tapes and VCRs, but those digital technologies, you know, CD players, eventually MP3 players and other digital music players, DVDs, and eventually streaming, really start becoming the norm for this generation as they're moving into their teen and emerging adult years, right? The internet becomes kind of commercially available and a kind of a commercial mass product in about 1995, 1996, where more people, especially in the middle class, start to get home internet as a sort of normal part of their lives, which means the oldest of the millennials, right, are about 14, 15, when the technology really hits. Now, for the youngest part of that cohort, you know, 1994, they're not going to remember a world in which the internet wasn't a sort of normal part of life, right? They may not have had it in the first few years, but for most of them, you know, by the time they can remember anything, the internet was there, and whether they had it at home or not, they ultimately will be aware of it for most of their lives, right? And yeah, this is, you know, the digital rather than analog generation. The first generation really to experience social media. Though for the most part, this hits kind of towards the late adolescent years to the kind of emerging adult years for the biggest part of this cohort, right? Most of them are, you know, remember a time before social media, but, you know, it would have been, millennials embraced social media very enthusiastically, you know, starting with things like MySpace, and then eventually Facebook, which I think became available as a mass product about 2006, right? So, you know, most of the, you know, or the first chunk of the millennials would have been adults as Facebook is coming out, but, you know, a large chunk of them would have been still, well, I guess they would have been emerging adults. A large chunk of them still would have been teenagers. So, you know, their teen years are marked by the introduction of social media as a major technology. Yeah, like I said, economically actually earning more on average by 2019 than the three previous generations did at the same point in their lives, adjusted for inflation. And because they have fewer children, millennials tend to have much more disposable income than older generations did, right? They basically have more to spend on themselves, which sounds about right for millennials. 34% less wealth than previous generations at the same age as of 2016, but by 2019 it was only 11% less. So they're catching up really, really quickly in terms of wealth. And yeah, because they went to school for longer than boomers or Xers, they started saving and buying homes later. So that partially explains this decline in wealth. Yeah, please.
Can you explain kind of the difference between having disposable income and having wealth in this context?
Yeah, so when we think of wealth, right, it would typically include things like assets, right? So how much do they own in terms of stocks, right? Like savings, you'd probably be talking in the US, things like 401ks, which are kind of the equivalent of RSPs, right? So how much have they invested in that? Stock ownership, property ownership, right? Do they own homes? And how much equity do they have, compared to the debt? That's sort of a couple of measures of wealth. Things like cars and other fun things that are worth something you can count as wealth as well. Bitcoin, if you made the mistake of buying Bitcoin and then lost half the value of it. I put, because I was curious, I put $100 into Bitcoin, and it is now worth $62, and I'm sad. I lost. Me and my friend were talking about it. He's incredibly wealthy, also the same age as me. And he's like, yeah, I just put like $10,000 into Bitcoin. I'm like, I also invested in Bitcoin. $100. And anyway, I just wanted to play. It was just fun. For me, for him, he's like, I made a mistake. I'm like, yes, you did. It doesn't matter. To him, he's like, I'll just sell the property. I'm like, cool, that sounds great. I could not, because I have one property, which is my house. And my children would be upset if I sold it. So, yeah, but does that answer your question? Yeah, so, and in terms of wealth, right, they started later into home ownership. In some ways, actually, the millennials were particularly blessed when it came to home ownership, because a lot of them bought when interest rates were near zero, right? Like, if you compare it to, say, the boomers, right? The boomers came in and were buying housing, oftentimes, when interest rates were above 10%, when they were entering kind of emerging adulthood in their early adult years. Which means that, much, much more expensive for them to get into the housing market. And it took them a lot longer to build that kind of wealth. For millennials, those who could afford to get into the housing market, I know it costs way more, right? A small refrigerator box in Vancouver costs only $2 million at this point. But, because interest rates were so low, they were able to borrow a lot of money, get into these houses, and then start building wealth by paying it back. So millennials, in that sense, I think are going to accelerate in terms of how much wealth they have really, really quickly following 2019. And especially following COVID, yeah.
So they had more immediate fiat earnings, but less wealth and assets in general?
Yeah, so because, in terms of, there's also some spending pattern differences for millennials. Millennials will be more likely to, how to put it, buy experiences, especially in their younger years, right? Because they don't get married, right? Because they're sort of, I don't want to say free and clear, but a lot of them are, not married, not having children until quite a bit later. They spend a lot more money on, trips to Thailand, especially in those early years, and they don't start building wealth as quickly. And that's just, again, a kind of delayed transition into adulthood that we see with the millennials. And it's just, again, the slow life strategy really starts to play out more and more as we move forward in generations, right? The kind of life for millennials, in most ways, rolls out much more slowly than it did for boomers, right? They enter adulthood in much, much slower patterns. But again, like the Xers before them, they seem to kind of exit childhood relatively early, but then spend a long time in sort of an extended adolescence or adolescence and emerging adulthood before really settling down and starting to seriously build wealth, right? So, okay, good questions. My YouTube stream is echoing really bad. Oh, maybe I'll just turn down the lapel mic. That might help a little bit. I could hear myself, so, all right, hopefully that helps. Yeah, so, sorry, the Kardashians. Some of them are millennials, a few of them are Gen Z. Millennials, not actually, I will say, for the record, that I have lived this long in my life being aware of the Kardashians, but having paid no attention to them. I have never watched anything that they've been in. And so people are, I know they exist, but I have no idea what they're about, other than they look like this and people seem to really like them. So I exist in a Kardashian-free universe for the most part, which I think is probably a good thing. Okay, millennials, yeah, not actually that poor. In terms of incomes, they're doing pretty well. Cost of living, obviously, is rising, especially the last couple of years, right? Kind of rampant inflation has made things a little bit more difficult, and again, probably slowed down that wealth building a bit. Higher college debt, this is true, in the US and Canada, to a lesser extent in Canada, but definitely in the US. College debt, definitely slowed down kind of wealth accumulation as well. Boomers and Gen X, in a lot of ways, had, much lower cost, higher education for those who went. And then you also have this thing where more millennials, because of the changes in the economy, more millennials are moving towards college education, and even more, towards, say, getting some kind of postgraduate degree, a master's of some kind. And because that's what the workforce seems to demand. I can't even tell you how many letters of reference I've written this year. I've lost count, but it's in the 40s. I also teach 1,000 students a year, so that plays in as well. But yeah, so higher college debt, they're spending more time in school. Now there is some kind of payoff for people as well, is these jobs that you get coming out of college in a lot of cases have higher pay. Right? Because you're more skilled, they have higher pay, so you're coming out and making a lot more money as well. Sky high expectations have also contributed to a disconnect between objective indicators of financial security and the perception of millennials that they think that they're hard done by economically. It seems for whatever reason that millennials expected that they were going to enter the workforce and essentially have the kind of wealth that baby boomers had in their 50s, really in their 50s, right? Where they were, at the end of their careers making as much money as they're ever going to make and buying vacation homes and motor homes or trailers that could double as a house for an average family, and these sorts of things. And millennials seem to think that that was going to come very quickly, and when it didn't, they're like, we're so poor. I can't even afford a big trailer with 2 slide outs. What is happening to the economy? Again, their parents took years to get to that point. So, social media seems to play a role as well, and this is where why I have the Kardashians up here. There seems to be a distinct phenomenon, you know this, right? Where everybody puts their best life ever on social media, right? No one ever puts, maybe people do, I don't know. I spend so little time on social media. Such a Gen Xer at heart. But people put their vacation pictures and all of the fabulous things about their life on social media, which creates a kind of perception that everybody's life is super glamorous and wonderful, when actually, it's not the Kardashians or this fabulous life, and not everybody spends half the year in Mexico or any of that. But when you see pictures of, all these fabulous places that people are, all the places they're visiting, their vacation photos from Rome, and all this stuff, it can create a sense that you're somehow behind the 8 ball. So there's a lot of social comparison for millennials going on with other millennials and all of this stuff. This used to be called keeping up with the Joneses. The Joneses were your next door neighbors, and they had the fancy car. And everything fancy, and you felt like you had to keep up with the Joneses. Now the Joneses are everybody on social media, and you're always kind of like, okay, I need to keep up with the Joneses, and the Joneses are everywhere and everyone all the time. So it makes for a very competitive environment, and an environment where people sometimes feel like they're always behind. Okay. All right. I don't know if that got fixed or not. Okay. Yeah, so, slow life. I mean, compare this, right, again, to the boomers and the silence, right? This is a much slower life plan, right? The average age of marriage for millennials is about 28 for women, 30 for men, which is so much later, right? This is the latest we've ever seen it. Okay, so what? I was going to say something. Now, I can't remember if it's on the slide or not. Yes, it does. Okay. Now, this isn't just because people are living with a partner, right? Cohabitation rates certainly have risen, but you know, the rate of, say, 25 to 34-year-olds living with a partner when Twenge was doing the research, so millennials, had also been declining. So there's just more people not in relationships, never getting married very late, or getting into relationships very late as well. Yeah, 1 in 4 millennial women had never been married by their late 30s. It was 1 in 18 for the boomers, right? So big change there. And 30% of men in their 30s had never been married, you know, double what it was for the boomers. So, you know, huge shifts in terms of these patterns. Yeah, please.
Does the later age for marriage relate to the higher life expectancy?
Higher life expectancy. I think mostly the higher life expectancy is, okay, now you're asking a really complicated question. Technically speaking, if you look at the social statistics, married people tend to live longer. For whatever reason, I think, you know, I don't even know. It's probably more companionship, you know, shared, you know, burdens and all these things. Married people tend to live longer than their unmarried counterparts. It's also possible that people who remain unmarried are more kind of risk takers, and so they'll do risky behaviors, risky sexual behaviors, and all sorts of things like that. That could kill you. So married people do tend to live longer. I think the bulk of the extended lifespans is probably medical technology, right? We're, you know, so much healthier because we have so much better diagnostics. We understand the human body so much better, and our pharmaceuticals are, you know, they wouldn't have even been imaginable, you know, when the silents were young. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, so I don't know that plays a role. Yeah, what else do I have here? Yeah, so millennials also having fewer children than any generation in history, right? This is, you know, TFR, when the millennials were, and the millennials are still having kids, right? Because there's still a whole bunch of millennials in that 30-year-old to 40-year-old range, which is still well within that fertile window. But it looks like the average is going to be about 1.4 children per woman, which isn't quite, you know, if you look at it, if you get about to 1, basically your population would half within a generation, but, or within a couple generations as the older generations die off and they're not replaced by your kids. So give about 50 years, your population should half. But yeah, I mean, it's not quite there. It's about 1.4. Looks like it'll be lower for Gen Z, and that seems pretty consistent. But yeah, I mean, they're having fewer children than any generation in previous history, right? I mean, so like, I know we have a whole bunch of millennial professors in the department, and almost none of them have children. And those that do have 1 child. So me and my boss runs the Center for Criminological Research. We both have 3 kids, and when people are like, how do you do it? I'm like, well, someone has to have kids. If we don't have kids and you don't have kids, right, then you know, the population will decline, and there will be no children of academics, so everyone will be dumber. I don't know. That's just a joke. That's just a joke, honestly. But that's the joke I make. It's like, some academics have to have children, and the academics notoriously, it's like 1 child or 0. Seems to be the pretty normal. And again, I'm kidding. Smart people don't have to come from academics. I'm kind of smart, hopefully. Neither of my parents are academics, certainly. So anyway, yeah, it's the average age of the mother at first birth of her child for women born in the early 90s, right? So right in that millennial generation is 27, so that's rising considerably. And I mean, I think when we get into Gen Z, though we don't have all the statistics on it yet, right? Because they're still in course, you're gonna see that rise into the 30s by the time Gen Z gets through. Now, again, that's not necessarily, like, it's not a moralistic problem. There are some practical realities to it, is that if you're kind of in, you know, start having children in your late 20s, you've essentially already missed some of your most, like, to put it crudely, your most fertile years, right? Oh yes, please, go ahead.
Didn't that first age
Out of marriage? Yeah, definitely, right? And marriage for millennials is becoming less common. You're having more and more people who simply don't get married. I get this all the time. Whenever I talk about marriage in SOC 100, people are like, why do I need a piece of paper or a ceremony to tell society or something? I don't know what their reasoning is. There's a bunch of it that you don't need the ceremony. So yeah, marriage is much less common. And yeah, when people are having children, they are having a lot of cases outside of marriage, right? And like I said, not a moralistic thing on terms of like fertility window. It's just if you start having, children in your late 20s, you're already kind of on the decline in terms of fertility as a woman. And so it's going to be harder to have children. And you have less time, right? If you started when you were like 21, you had more time to have more children. Having children is hard, and especially having a lot of young children in close sequence is really difficult. And so it leaves less time for people to have, families of 2 or 3, because, you just don't have the time. And who wants 3 kids in diapers at the same time? No one, trust me. It's not a lot of fun. So yeah, like slow life and individualism are the likely causes, right? It's a cultural shift when we talk about the millennials. They're just growing up slower. And it's just a result of changes in society, right? You can see this percent of US 25 to 39-year-olds who are married, right? It declines and declines down to the millennials. Percentage of US 25 to 34-year-olds with certain living arrangements, right? With a romantic partner is declining, right? And it declines all through the millennials, so lots more people living alone. Slightly more people alone or with roommates. Not a huge jump though. And then living with parents takes a little spike. That's fun. Everyone wants to live with their parents, right? Okay, what was the top one? Percent of US 25 to 29-year-old men who are never married versus married. So you can see, right, in terms of never married adults versus married adults, they're essentially like kind of parallel, or not parallel lines, intersecting lines, right? You're getting fewer and fewer people getting married as time goes forward. Okay. In terms of religion, right? So religion, millennials, you'll know this if you took my SOC of religion class. Super interested in religion. I have a whole unit on it later. So in terms of religious beliefs, right, we see generally declines when we talk about the millennials, right? And the millennials seem to be the sort of inflection point where religion had a pretty steady hold in society, and with millennials, it just sort of hits this, point and it starts to decline, right? Maybe, if you took social religion, maybe Steve Bruce was right. Maybe this is the point at which religion starts to decline. And you kind of see this, right, when you look at the kind of different generational cohorts, percentage of US adults engaged in religious practices, right? Do they ever pray? No. Okay, look, these are still in majority territory. It's just a big drop, right? It was like 93% of silence ever prayed versus like 76% of millennials, right? And Gen Z is even lower, all still in majority territory, believe in God, right? It's down in the 60-ish percent, mid-60s, right, for millennials, a little bit higher for Gen Z. As they get older, it'll probably drop. If you want to know why, in the fall, come take social religion with me, we'll talk about it. Because we can't get into all of it right now. But yeah, so believe in God, ever attend services, right? And again, all of these things are in majority territory. They're still well in the majority, but they're declining sharply generation to generation. Okay, and percent of US 26 to 40-year-olds engaging in private religious practices, again, is declining, right? Ever pray, believe in God, or think that the Bible is the inspired word. All of those things are declining. Again, still majority territory. None of them drop below 70% as of 2015, 2018, but still in decline. And yeah, we get also what's the growth of the nuns. Yes?
These statistics apply to like all religions, or is it primarily Catholic and Christian?
So it's all religions, right? But when you're talking about the US, you're still, especially the US, Canada's a little different. And again, I could get into it. I have the slides. Do you want to go to sociology of religion? I could pull them up right now and show you the breakdowns. In the US, you're still talking about, very small minorities of Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Jews, and other, any religion that doesn't fit in those categories. It's below 7%, right? Everybody else is either nothing in particular, or no religion, or Christian, right? And it's, even US immigration has been a little bit different historically, where most of the immigration has continued to come from historically Christian countries. Principally Latin America, right? Where most people are either Catholic or Protestant in some way. So anyway, I could talk about this all day. I really could. I know it. It's all in there somewhere. And I love it. It's a super interesting topic. I think about it constantly. But yeah, it's mostly, still either Christian or kind of former Christian is the most common kind of categorization. Weird things like, technically speaking, in terms of single religious groups, the largest religious group in America remains Catholics. And if you took all ex-Catholics and made them a religious group called ex-Catholics, they would be the second largest religious group in the United States. So, all sorts of things. Okay, does that answer your question? Okay, perfect. All right, so so the growth of the nuns, so N-O-N-E-S, in the United States and in Canada as well. It's growing faster in Canada, actually. So people who are, when they answer the question on a survey, what is your religion? They put no religion or nothing in particular or something like that. Depends on the survey, how it's asked. Atheist, agnostic get bumped into the nun category as well. So we've seen the growth of the nuns, and especially what are called cradle nuns, right? Essentially people who were raised with no religion. We see more and more of this in Gen Z especially, but it starts with millennials too. A lot of millennials, raised with no religion. So, good times. Was there a spike in divorce rates for boomers because of millennial move for self-improvement? I don't know. No, I think the spike in boomer divorces really starts in the 80s, right? And it peaks around 1986 because there's specific changes to divorce laws in both Canada and the US. Essentially, they bring in no-fault divorce in both countries, which causes a big spike. Because now, all you have to, you could be like a rock star and basically say, why are you getting divorced? Irreconcilable differences, and that's all you need to say. You don't need to be like, he beats me, or she beats me, or he's been unfaithful, she's been unfaithful. You don't have to give a reason, so that causes a big spike for the boomers. But it's not really related to the millennials, I don't think. Okay. Okay, very quickly, right? The information I'm going to take from here is all going to come from National Study of Youth and Religion for a little bit here until we get very quickly to Gen Z. So, I won't describe it, but basically you can kind of read here. It's a big survey that's basically been ongoing for the better part of a decade and a half. That gathered a lot of information about the lives of millennials and millennials around religion, but in general as well. Okay, so now those are the waves. Okay. So what did the millennials look like out of the National Study of Youth and Religion, Christian Smith, who's the head of it, basically wrote a couple of books about the millennials as they're moving through those emerging adult years. One of them was called Souls in Transition, specifically about their religious lives, and one of them was called Lost in Transition, about their move into emerging adulthood. Okay, so what did their lives look like as they're entering emerging adulthood? And I think this will tell us a lot, about Gen Z as well. Like, what do the lives of young people look like as they're moving, through late adolescence into emerging adulthood? Okay, so they go through a lot of transitions, right? Big and often unanticipated ones. So there's things like moving out, moving back in, and moving out again, typically to go to college or university, right? They move, they come back home, they graduate, they move back in with their parents because they can't afford to support themselves, and all of these fun sorts of things. They are attending college and university, in their emerging adult years for the most part. Some of them graduate, some of them drop out, some of them take breaks, right? And transition to whole new kind of paths than what they thought they were going to do. They enter the workforce and they switch career paths very quickly, right? They discover what they like and don't like, and they go through all these sorts of transitions. As they get into emerging adulthood, lots of parents get separated, some of them get remarried, right? So they're dealing with shifting family dynamics. And it seems like for the boomers and Gen Xers, for the parents of millennials, some of them were just kind of holding on until their kids were out of the house, and then the marriages completely fell apart. It's like, we'll stay together for the kids, and then the kids are gone, and it's like, screw you. And off they go. So, they take jobs, they quit jobs, right? They're moving into the workforce and navigating some of the challenges of that. We'll talk about that when we get to work. And then they transition friend groups multiple times, right? They have their high school friends, they then go to college, make new friends, transition out of college, a lot of those college friends fall away, and then they move into, work friends and building new relationships, and go through lots and lots of relationship transitions. They experiment with romantic relationships for the first time, and all of this fun stuff. Okay, I have too many question slides on this one. As they're moving into emerging adulthood, and maybe this is where some of you are at as well, they want to stand on their own 2 feet, right? There's still this expectation of adulthood, but it's a challenge, right? Transitioning from dependence on parents and dependence on systems that have been set up to guide youth to a very much unstructured kind of world is a big challenge for a lot of them. They want to get to a point where they can be independent, particularly financially. So a lot of things that were structured in high school break down in the college years, right? Like in high school, you knew where you were supposed to be, you knew what you were supposed to do, right? This high school schedule is kind of rigid and inflexible, and you're still kind of, expected to be a kid and obey your parents in some ways. As they move into college and beyond, right, there's no one holding you accountable, especially in college, right? You don't even have to show up to class if you don't want to, right? You become this sort of free agent with fewer and fewer people holding you accountable. And this becomes a big transition where suddenly you go from structured to unstructured, right? A host of new skills need to be learned along the way to adulthood, right? Paying bills, fixing things. I'm still bad at this. Thankfully, you know what? YouTube has tutorials on how to fix stuff. I fixed my dishwasher the other day with the help of a YouTube video. And so I didn't have to call my friend who's a plumber, which is always kind of embarrassing. Getting insurance, right? Navigating life, and romantic relationships, and especially in those emerging adult years, romance is a tricky one. And we'll talk about that when we talk about sex and intimacy. Trust me, it'll be fun. They don't typically in emerging adulthood. Those first few years, people feel like they don't have enough money, and they're living paycheck to paycheck. And that's pretty normal of entering the workforce in most ways. These are the adulting tasks that they have to master. Did they eat a vegetable? All of those things that people have to master. Got off the couch by noon. Oh, didn't wear yoga pants. I don't know why that's a thing. Okay, optimism. So, according to Smith and Snell, Snell wrote the book Lost in Transition with Christian Smith. She was his grad student at the time. Millennials were a pretty optimistic generation, especially the older ones, right? They thought about the future, and they thought the future was going to be pretty bright, despite knowing they're not where they wanted to be, right? They don't have the trailer with 3 slide outs, but they thought that they would get there. Now, this gets dampened a little bit after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, where then there's some question, are we ever going to catch up? And millennials will get the sense that they've been screwed over in the economy. But that's a story for another time. Less typically, right, they know optimism is normal, right? There's a subgroup of millennials who are like, I know I should be optimistic, and that's the normal kind of way that my generation thinks about things, and yet I feel a struggle to be optimistic. I call this Monday in general. I'm like, oh, I know I should be optimistic, but it's Monday, and I don't want to be. But jokes aside, right? There's a subset who know that they're out of sync with their generation in terms of optimism. Okay. Now, optimistic in spite of suffering a lot of hardships, right? Just because, the millennials are optimistic doesn't mean they didn't have a tough life. Especially the older part of the millennials are still at the sort of outside edge of some of the drug problems that came from the 1980s, right? So things like, alcoholism or drug use are things that they've faced, right? Millennials, too, were in this weird kind of cultural space where they started drinking relatively early. It was, I guess, before people had Netflix, there was nothing to do. So, you know, people would score as much alcohol as they could and drink, the pretty normal thing. All right, you know, this was sort of my experience of high school, especially once I turned 18 and I had a car. People were like, could you buy booze for me? I'm like, yes, but it will cost you. I made a fair bit of money before anyone else turned 18 in high school, I'll put it that way. And I had a car, so I could deliver. It was great. And gasoline cost 32 cents a liter at the time, so that was, you know, it kind of all worked out. I was like an Uber alcohol delivery thing before it was a thing. That only lasted about 6 months. Okay, I thank my parents for thinking I was too immature to be in first grade when I was like really little. They were probably right, so they held me back, and then I was the oldest in my class, which meant I was 18 and no one else was. I made a lot of money. I paid for my first year of university bootlegging. Don't tell anyone that. I think it's still a crime, but I think I'm past the statute of limitations. Anyway, my parents are like, how do you have all this money? I'm like, I don't know. I'm just gonna go out for a drive on Friday night, okay? I don't know if they believe me. I should ask. Okay. So, some of them have been sexually exploited, right, and had bad sexual experiences. A lot of them experienced divorce, right? They kind of got caught in the wave of divorces in the 1980s and forward, right? And again, it peaks in 1986, but it just slowly goes down after that. So a lot of them are the children of divorce. Relationship betrayals, right? They've been cheated on by partners. Accidents, injuries, you know, obviously happen to everybody. Academic failures, right? Coming into college, a lot of them, you know, struggle and fail or fail in high school, don't get into the programs they wanted to get into. Job disappointments, some degree parental abandonment, right? There's obviously, that happens all the time, sadly to some subset, and millennials experience this in higher numbers than other generations did prior, again, because of these marital breakdowns. And then racism and death of friends, right? A lot of times due to, like, one of the leading causes for millennials is drunk driving, right? You have a big surge in deaths of drunk driving, especially in the late 90s, which is where, you know, MAD really gets a lot of its life. Yeah, so no shortage of hard experiences, but millennials, undeterred, believe in themselves no matter what. Oh, no regrets. I know it's spelled correctly, but I'm going to read it as no regrets anyway. Oh, can I do this in 2 minutes? I can do this very quickly in 2 minutes. Okay. So, things that happened in the past are in the past, right? And the millennials have this really interesting view of the past. It's like you're shaped by your past, and so, you know, there's hardships, but they don't weigh the millennials down in a lot of ways. It's like, and one of the kind of refrains that Smith talks about when it comes to millennials is they're like, well, those hard things made me who I am. And so in a lot of cases, it's like they have no regrets. They wouldn't change them because whatever it was, their partner cheated on them, you know, they failed out of university, that made them who they are, so they have no regrets. So they put a sunny face on difficult things, which allows them to keep moving forward with that optimism. Yeah, and since the core of millennial experience is being who I am or discovering who you are, negative experiences are always framed in terms of helping you become who you are today. Okay, well, we'll leave it there. I could talk about parents, but I can't do it in a minute. So we'll keep going. With millennials on Monday, I added a lot of content, so this may slightly change the outlook on the first exam. We'll talk about that as we get closer. Oh dear, my battery is dying. Might make it.